and I will pass the mic over to Mary.
Thank you so much, Chris. As Chris said, I am a professor of psychology at UTSA. I'm also a clinical psychologist. I have a small private practice, and in a weird way, my entire professional life has kind of come to a peak here in talking about what's going on in the pandemic. I've always studied stress and coping, both from a physiological side and a clinical side. And I've also been interested in how to use what we find in the lab to understand how to help people in real life. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been volunteering as a disaster mental health specialist, first with the Red Cross, and then also with this group you can see in the picture, Green Cross Academy of Traumatology, and you can see that we're just really rocking our green vests there. But this is a group that goes to disasters and provides mental health care, and I wanted to bring that in because I'm going to be talking about the disaster that we're caught up in and how some of those principles of disaster management might be helpful for us today. When Alex Maxwell and I were talking about this topic, I wasn't sure what to call it. And then I realized that oftentimes when we discuss stress, we say, well, today I'm going to discuss student stress, or I'm going to discuss faculty stress. And I came around to thinking of it as yours, mine, and ours, because we all have individual sources of stress, but then we also have some collective stresses that are happening in 2020, which are impacting everything else. If you've been attending some of the lectures during this conference, you've probably heard quite a bit about the sources of student stress, why today's students are not traditional 18-year-olds living in the dorm, not working, those kinds of things. And we've known for a while that rates of stress, anxiety, and depression are up in college students. This was actually a topic even when I was training clinically back in the early 90s. It's accelerated, and all of the reasons that we've been discussing this whole conference, from increased expectations to increased costs, are part of it. And then, of course, in March, when things collapsed on all of us and we were suddenly online, many of our students faced problems not only with not having technology and Wi-Fi, but also losing jobs, moving home, dealing with families. So many of the stressors got exacerbated at that point. I really don't need to talk a lot about faculty stress. It's sort of like preaching to the choir in this group. But there's a great deal of evidence that suggests that being a faculty member is not exactly an easy existence. We know that faculty workloads have gone up in terms of larger classes, reduced resources, pressure to publish and get grants even when money is getting tighter, much greater variation in the preparation of our students. One of the things that being part of the UT System Teaching Academy has showed me, though, is how different sources of stress are at different kinds of universities. So the Teaching Academy is made up of the 8 UT System schools. We're spread from El Paso to Tyler. Some are small, some are huge. Our students vary. And it's been very interesting to talk about what people find stressful in their environment. Here at this conference, I know we have people from community colleges, small private schools, larger private schools. And so I know there's a range of stressors, but the thing that pulls us all together is somewhere in the middle of last March, we suddenly started teaching from our kitchen tables. Now, as I said, I have a background in studying disasters, and I really wanted to emphasize the fact that even though this pandemic doesn't look like a traditional disaster, it is a slow rolling crisis which is changing everybody and our lives and our future. We've then superimposed the racial tension and the social inequities that are coming to light because of that. And I really don't think that that's a coincidence. I think in some ways, having had the lockdown and slowing down made it even more apparent that we had to look at how this pandemic was affecting people differently. Of course, at our universities, we're facing this as well. My university has already laid off over 300 staff members since the pandemic started. We're not sure how many more people will be laid off. A lot of them were non-tenure track folks. So all of these pressures are coming together. And it's not surprising that many of us feel sort of this ambient sense of anxiety, just this underlying fear that something bad's going to happen and we need to be ready for it. This was an experiment that was done January through April. And all they were doing was asking Americans in general how stressed and anxious they felt and how much they were enjoying their lives. And if you look at it, what you see is that the pandemic caused a significant increase in the negative emotions and a decrease in the positive ones. I haven't been able to find a survey that did, April till now. I will keep an eye out for that because I suspect that as this drags on and the uncertainty continues, the trend will stay the same. I don't know if there will be some differences as people adapt, but that'll be interesting to look at. Now, I wanted to tell a little story in the midst of all this because I think it will kind of pull together my yours, mine, and ours analogy, and also then let me talk about coping with the stress of this pandemic. On January 28th of this last semester, I went to Urbino, Italy with 64 students from UTSA and 2 other faculty for a study abroad program. It's an amazing program. This is the castle that is in Urbino. It was built by the Duke. We were living in Urbino, attending the school. We were supposed to be there for 13 weeks, and we came home after 4. On March 2nd, well, really a couple days before that, the university realized that the pandemic was spreading in northern Italy. And we went through about 48 hours of absolute chaos. It was just a little bit sooner than the US had really realized that the pandemic was a problem. So none of the airlines wanted to change our flights. The students' parents were calling from the States. The students were angry. They were distraught. We ended up leaving Urbino at 3 in the morning. And I don't know if you can see in this picture where the moon is showing, but that's the street. You walk down this really steep street, 60 of us with our rolling suitcases on the cobblestones. I'm pretty sure the people who lived there knew we were leaving. The other picture is of the bus. We took a 4-hour bus ride. We'd had to actually get a special bus because by the time we left, the university did not want us to stop in Florence or Bologna or the cities that were closer. We had to go to Rome. It had all of the drama of, leaving the country like Sound of Music, and none of the music and none of the good parts. The students were very stressed. We were all tired. It took us 26 hours to get home. And they met us at the airport. UTSA officials, we went into official 2-week self-isolation period. A doctor called us every day. We had to record our symptoms. The good news is that all of us came through without testing positive for COVID. But you can imagine how stressed we were, how stressed the students were, the university trying to get us home. And I had a little baby kind of experiment in seeing how to get people through the pandemic. Because for 14 days, I was talking on WhatsApp to my 17 psych students every day about being home alone. Some of them were stuck in a hotel because they didn't have a home that they could safely go back to. How were we going to cope? How were they going to finish? What did they feel about graduation? And it was a bonding time for us. We did finish our classes online, and 5 of those students did graduate, of course, without an actual graduation ceremony. But that was where I really started thinking that we need to talk about the stress of what's going on a little differently than we traditionally talk about student stress or faculty stress. As part of that exodus from Italy, as it should be, the university was really, really focused on getting the students home. And it wasn't until we got back that it really dawned on us that of the 3 professors who were there, 2 of us were over 60. If anyone had gotten sick and had problems, it would have been us. And we hadn't thought of it, the university hadn't thought of it. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be considered in these study abroad and other programs. And if we ever get back together, we're supposed to have a meeting to sort of debrief some of that. But as this pandemic has gone on, the uncertainty, the panic, the frustration that we felt when we were leaving Italy has sort of spread through the world. Also the hostility, as we were trying to get out of Italy before they shut the borders, Facebook at UTSA was filling up with messages saying, don't let those plague carriers come back to campus. We know this has been a really stressful and charged situation for lots of people. So that's where I want to start talking about it as a disaster. Now, if I went to a regular, quote unquote, natural disaster, I would actually be able to go into it expecting to see people at a certain psychological state. This is a diagram. You can get it online. I can give the link if anyone wants it as well. But what it shows is kind of the stages of coping. And when you have a disaster like a fire or a hurricane or an earthquake, you know, sometimes there's pre-disaster warning, sometimes there's not. But there tends to be a clear impact point, followed by predictable steps. In the very early heroic days, we are really happy to hear about the people who risk their lives, helping others, saving people, civilians who go to great lengths to help their neighbors, first responders, healthcare workers. And then we move into this honeymoon stage where you see a lot of cooperation. And in both of these stages, what people are saying is, you know, it's just stuff. At least we all survived. You really see how good human nature is. We're all going to get through this. But after the cameras go home, after the drama has passed, time sets in and people do go into a disillusionment stage. I actually went to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and the first time we went in was 3 months after the hurricane. And people were very much in the disillusionment stage. They were still camping in their yards without running water, without power. And of course, what happens is once you get over being glad you survived and start looking at how much work there is and what you need to do to go forward, it becomes daunting. The good news is that people are very resilient. They do come through disasters. But the reason I'm showing this diagram is because I think we can use it, but we have to adapt it for the pandemic because there's not one impact. We would need to draw a line that shows where it's surging in our community, where it's dropping off. I don't think we will really get to recovery until we get to the stage where we have enough people vaccinated that it's not an immediate threat. And because we don't know when that is, the uncertainty is part of what's adding to the stress. But I still think that this is a really nice way to kind of conceptualize what's happening with us, our families, our students. In my clinical practice, the last few weeks, what I'm hearing the most of is how sick people are of the people they live with. And that's a sign of disillusionment. They have been with those people for months now. They can't go out and do the normal things they want to do. And they're not sure when this is going to end either. Now, of course, if this was a traditional disaster, we would also know what some of the common psychological responses are. And as you look at this list, I'm going to guess that you're going to go, well, there's no difference there between what might happen after a fire and what is happening in the midst of this pandemic. Throughout this presentation, I decided to salt some of the pictures from my disaster travels, in part because they remind me of what it is like dealing with people who have lost everything they have had to regroup on their entire future, and still find ways to do that. The fire pictures here are from Paradise, California. California. I was out there last year. The entire town burnt to the ground, and they're still in the rebuilding process. But when you are talking to people who've had that kind of major loss, your goal is not to do traditional therapy to fix everything that's wrong with them. It is to help them come to terms with an immediate stress that is going on so that they can take control of what they want to do next. One of the things that really catches people off guard when they're in a disaster situation is how erratic their feelings can be, intense, unpredictable, how sensitive they can be to things. Some people really struggle with making sense of what's going on, the spiritual concerns. Sometimes it causes them to question assumptions they had about their community or their government or their legal rights. Again, I included these pictures from after Hurricane Harvey down in Rockport, Texas, which was the epicenter. That's where the hurricane came aground. And when you're walking around a setting where everything's tipped over, it's a little easier to say, gosh, maybe there's a reason I feel disoriented. During the pandemic, I think that's one of the major problems. You look out your window, things look normal. But in terms of planning for the future and what we're doing, and also our awareness of sort of the riskiness of life, this pandemic is bringing on a lot of those same kinds of feelings. Now, I've talked a little bit about the student stress side of it, but I also wanted to talk about the fact that faculty have actually become non-traditional first responders. And this is a topic that's going on in the disaster response world already. You know, when you are a fireman, a policeman, a paramedic, a medical health care worker, you don't expect a pandemic like this, but you signed up to be there to help people, and you've had training in responding in crises. The first non-traditional responders that rolled out of this pandemic were the grocery store and restaurant workers who were trying to keep food flowing. It's the delivery workers, it's the infrastructure folks who are going to jobs that have suddenly become essential. The government calls them essential, but they haven't got training in crisis management, in putting their life on the line every time they go out, in dealing with very stressed people, and they don't always have authority either. You can see the kind of fights that are happening at stores when someone tries to get a customer to wear a mask. So there's been a lot of problems, and I would say that many of our students are on that front line of working those kinds of jobs, if they're even lucky enough to be working. This is a picture of my Urbino group when we were in Bologna in Italy before we came back. At least 3 of these students are working HEB curbside or pizza delivery or those kind of jobs. And we've had conversations about how that feels. But I'm not the only faculty member that's having those conversations. One of the things my colleagues have been talking about since the pandemic started is that switching to online changed the way we interact with students. There are some we never see. They just come, they do their work, they go. But there are others that are in major crisis who are reaching out to us with problems they might not have told us about in a normal semester. If this was a real talk, I'd ask people to raise hands. I'm curious, but I suspect a lot of you have had emails or texts or comments that made you really worry about a student, either about their health, they or their family has COVID, or about their coping. Maybe they're saying things that make you wonder if they're very depressed, or about them dropping out of school. One of the students in that group from Urbino he took an incomplete on our classes. He's dropped out for the summer. Both of his parents in the Rio Grande Valley got laid off, and he's doing drywall right now to keep the family in a place. So you're probably hearing those stories. And the thing is, a lot of faculty members weren't trained to be first responders either. We didn't come into academics necessarily to be a psychologist. We came in to teach the thing we love, the discipline, the area, and suddenly we're hearing those things. So what I wanted to say to the faculty watching here, and I've been saying to lots of my colleagues, is that the techniques I would use when I landed in a disaster are things you can learn and use in your classrooms right now. This is a whole movement. It's sometimes called psychological first aid. It's sometimes called mental health first aid. You can take trainings online or in person as short as 2 hours, as long as 8 hours. But what you want to think about with psych first aid is it's the mental health version of CPR. You're not the provider. You're not going to be the surgeon who fixes the problem. But when you learn CPR, your goal is to keep someone stabilized until the right person can get there to help you. So what is psych first aid? You ask people right off the bat practical questions. All right, you didn't take my test because your dad got laid off. You're not sure where your family's going to live. How can we connect you up with some resources? How can we deal with that before we start talking about how you're going to finish your coursework? Sometimes there aren't resources you can give people, but one thing we've learned about this pandemic is that most people are lonely. A lot of people don't have many people who will talk and listen. And so just normalizing what's going on, just going back to that diagram I showed and said, you know, at this point in a disaster, we're all disillusioned, and forgetting things and being stressed and distracted is not a sign that you're losing your mind. It's a sign that you are stressed and overwhelmed. I had that conversation with a student recently. She said she was making errors at work because she kept forgetting things. And given the stress level she's under, it made sense to me. So what was our conversation? How can you use lists, Post-its, notes? How can you stop saying, I'm such a bad employee, I'm forgetting things, and say, in this time of stress, how can I address that problem? The social connections, we all know that, and a lot of this conference has been about connecting students to us, to each other, to campus resources. But I don't think we can say that enough, because even though we're lucky to have Zoom, we're lucky to have text and phone, it's not the same, and we have to work hard to make it meaningful. The other thing that faculty can do, and I'll have another slide for this, but just like you would do in CPR, you know how to call 911, you know how to refer students, and that's probably the most important thing a faculty member can do after listening to the student, getting your best sense of how they're doing, and then figuring out who to connect them to so they can get some help. I'll come back to that slide, but I want to talk about perspective and hope for a minute, because this sometimes comes across as sort of, you know, touchy-feely, or, you know, we're elite academics and we pride ourselves in critical thinking and kind of being cynical. But this is a time where we have to be the adults in the room for our students, for ourselves, for our families. And this pandemic is not unprecedented. I was on a panel a couple months ago with a historian and an anthropologist, and we talked about how people dealt with the pandemic in 1918 and how the Spanish flu was and wasn't like what we're going through now. Young people, especially high school and college age students, they don't have much perspective at all on going through bad situations. So they look at the rioting on TV, they look at the, you know, problems happening in their communities. And unless we step up and say, you know, this is a moment of change, and sometimes that's the place where you can really make a difference. This is an opportunity for you to contribute. And let's look back at other times when it seemed like things weren't going to get better. My dad's 88, and his comment on the pandemic is it reminds him a lot of being a kid during World War II in a tiny town up in northern Maine. There wasn't anything to do. All of the men were gone fighting, but back home they were just trying to keep enough food and firewood in place. But he said everyone was constantly, you know, watching, well, could someone bother the trains here? Is there anyone that's unfamiliar we don't know? Kind of this edginess. And the phrase they used, which I really like, he said, you know, everyone would couch every comment with, for the duration. Well, for the duration, we're not going to have enough fuel. For the duration, we're not going to have enough food. But what that really says is it's not going to last forever. It doesn't say this is the end. It says for this time, things are tough, but we're really going to assume that we're going to move out of that at some other point. So I was thinking again, how can I help faculty who don't want to be a therapist, but they want to help their students apply this psych first aid? And I think that it's really the things that good teachers are already doing. It is problem solving, helping them problem solve. As little as, I was talking to a student the other day whose mom couldn't co-sign her apartment this fall because her mom's got laid off. How do we talk that through? Who else can you ask? What else can you do? Oftentimes, they don't have anyone else to talk to about those kinds of things, and just helping them work through it. She was shocked, I was not, to find out that when she went to the leasing office where she'd lived for a year and explained it, they said, look, we can make an exception. Let's work through this. But a lot of times you don't see that when you're stressed. But I also think that engaging in perspective and perspective building and hope helps us. And one of the things I was pushing with my Urbino kids during our 14-day isolation, we got out of isolation on March 16th and San Antonio closed on March 19th. So we bragged that we've been self-isolating longer than anyone else we know. But we spent some time thinking about what were the good things about being home. Some of the students started an exercise plan, some started relaxation, some started keeping a journal. I challenged them to try to find something new that they would have told me they didn't have time to do before, like paint or draw or do something. And I also challenged them to revisit our Italy trip and create some itineraries for what they're going to see when they go back. We got to Rome, we didn't get to Florence, we didn't get to Venice. So what is it they want to see? And it doesn't have to be that you're going to do it next month. But again, it's that feeling that you could move forward and that there's going to be something to move forward to. Sometimes people say, yeah, well, whatever, you don't understand how hard my life is. I want to tell this story because it is so strange. In 2008, I went to Galveston with the Red Cross as a disaster mental health responder. The tent on the side there was set up in a middle school field parking lot. People were living there because there'd been so much damage, and Galveston's a small-ish island. There wasn't enough housing there. We were providing mental health support to people who'd lost their houses, their pets, their apartments, their friends. And we were ironically staying at Moody Gardens, which is one of the big hotels and resorts there. You might have remembered it because one of their aquariums got a lot of damage, and so they lost some of their fish and some of their animals. That's the picture. Well, what I could never in a million years have predicted in 2008, when I was talking to people about how to survive a hurricane, is that 10 years later, my daughter would get married in the same hotel where I'd been living on generators. When we were there, they had us in one wing, the generators were on, kitchen service was reduced, and then we had a wedding there. But what it reminds me of is that things change. We have to tell ourselves that. We have to tell our students that. And younger people especially have trouble because they don't have a lot of experience seeing that things are going to get better. Sometimes they'll get worse too, but that a lot of the battle is just hanging in there long enough. So that's kind of my Moody Garden hope story. Sometimes you're going to run into a student that you really feel like I can tell them everything I need and I can't help them. And that may be indicative of the need to get them or refer them for mental health services. This is a talk I would give even if we weren't in a pandemic because of the high rates of depression and anxiety among college students. I've listed some of the things that you might notice. Now, if you teach a huge class, you may not notice changes in study habits or just who's sleeping. But sometimes in a smaller class, you can figure it out. I had a young man who slept in the back of my physio psych class every single week. It was an evening class. Finally asked him, got him after class when people weren't around and said, what's going on? This guy worked in a busing company. He was driving long distance bus drives from Las Vegas to San Antonio and then trying to come to class. And he said, but it's okay. I don't need to get an A in your class. I just need to get a C, because then I can graduate. And if I have a degree, I can go up in management in the bus company. And after that, I was like, sleep, do whatever you want, just pass the class. But sometimes we have to be aware of those kinds of things. In his case, it was not a problem. Talked to another student who was sleeping in my class. I'm happy to say this story turned out well, but he was an African-American male who had a Gates scholarship, but he was using the money to support his younger brother and his mentally ill mom. And then he was moonlighting as a phlebotomist at night at a hospital. He was someone who needed both some emotional and some financial support. The good news is he sent me a notice when he finished medical school. So we got him there, but it took a while. Right now, you're most likely to see these things in texts, messages, explanations for why they turned stuff in late, why they didn't get there in time for the test. And I'm on my campus's behavioral intervention team. You might call it a care team or something else on your side. But we're getting lots of reports where students send emails or written assignments to faculty expressing a lot of discouragement, and they send them to us so we can basically identify whether they have enough support, whether they might be suicidal, and those kinds of things. The picture here was a civilian campground during Hurricane Harvey. People were living there because they didn't have anywhere else to live. This is not in most faculty's, bag of tricks. This entire conference has been about how to make our classes engaging and relevant and good. But I think we should all do this. And I don't think you usually have to start from scratch. If you were to contact your counseling center or your ombuds service, there are probably people on the social, student affairs side who already have these listings. But knowing how to get a student connected to counseling or health services, knowing who the ombuds person is if they've got a complicated problem. Figure out what they call it on your campus. It's going to be something. It's going to be behavioral intervention or care or, response team, but know who those people are and how to refer to them if you have a problem. We had one come in this week at UTSA. A faculty member got an email from a student who said, if I don't pass this class, then I might as well just give up. I don't know if I even want to go on living. We got that message after hours, ended up having San Antonio PD go out and check on that student. Maybe that sounds like a big response, but sometimes they go out and help that student get to the emergency room. So just knowing that you don't have to make the call, you just have to know who to ask about it. Our counseling center at UTSA has lists of community services. I think it's really useful for us to know those too. I had no idea that Catholic Services Association will pay 1 month's utility bill, no questions asked, if you apply to them. Think about the people you might know right now who are looking at the power being shut off. It's a one time in a lifetime, but sometimes that really matters. So I would like to see all of our schools just having these things available for faculty. And again, my point is not that you're going to solve the student's problem. It's that you're going to do what we do a lot in academics, which is point them to what they should read and think and do. But they may be unable to do it. Also want to say that our behavioral intervention team takes referrals on faculty and staff too. And we can get stressed, we can need help. And so a lot of these resources might also be things that the people around you could take advantage of. Wanted to bring up one more kind of specific topic here, and then I will leave time for questions. But I love this cat. He was sitting on a porch of a burned out house in Paradise, California, and he just looks over it, doesn't he? I don't know how he survived. I heard stories of people who drove their cars through burning roads. Some people got out of their cars and ran and got in fire trucks to get out of sites, but he survived. But he sort of encompasses what we call compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is different than burnout. And it really has to do with getting worn down by hearing lots of sad stories or stress from other people. So let me do that comparison. When you have compassion fatigue, you might have some of the same symptoms of stress that I listed before, but you might find that you're just not as into your job, you're having trouble remembering things, you're getting more depressed or anxious or angry about things than they really merit. You know, the kind of classic crying at a TV commercial or yelling because you dropped something. Having sleep problems is a huge component of stress in general, also of compassion fatigue. When you're a first responder or a disaster mental health person who works with trauma, we talk about this every day. When Green Cross deploys in the field, one of the people on the team is the compassion fatigue monitor specialist. They have the right to even override the team lead and say, you know what, we've been working for 10 hours for 5 days and we're not doing well and we're going to take the evening off. I wish we had compassion fatigue specialists in academics too. I wish we had people who were watching out for our mental health. I can assure you that if even one person at UTSA had called us in Urbino during that 48 hours of chaos and said, you guys doing okay? Anything the faculty need? It made it a lot easier in that situation. So what compassion fatigue is, that combination of being burnt out because of people drawing on you too much, wanting too much from you, and also dealing with their stress. It's not the same as burnout. You can have both. I suspect, especially as we talk more about Zoom exhaustion and all those kinds of things, that we're going to see some of this increasing over the semester as people just get tired of coping with this pandemic. What can you do? This is all the stuff that faculty, frankly, suck at. Most faculty don't, grad school doesn't really make you good at self-care. How many people do you know who take pride in staying up all night, working all weekend, being that person who's always busy, maybe doesn't always have time for their friends and family because they got one more paper they have to write or test they have to grade or something like that. And faculty are like doctors and police officers, people who are used to being the expert. We don't like to ask for help. We don't like to go and say, hey, I don't think I'm coping as well. Maybe sometimes we'll do it with our colleagues. But even if you don't want to ask somebody for help, there are some really good coping strategies out there. This is a separate topic, but if anyone ever would like to address it, I think we should be teaching faculty what we teach therapists, which is boundary setting. People say to me, how can you work with people who are mentally distressed all day or every day? And the point is you have to learn to draw boundaries, not to cut them out, but also not to take their problems home with you. And I think faculty could use some training in that kind of area. I had to add these two dogs. This was a little tiny town in Puerto Rico called Toa Baja. We went out there with a medical aid group. There's a river that runs through Toa Baja and it flooded during Maria. So for 2 weeks, the entire town had 10 feet of water. It took me like the first 5 people I talked to who were residents to figure out, they would all say to me, I'm living in my second house. I finally figured out they meant my second story. They just all moved upstairs because the downstairs of their houses were flooded. These 2 dogs lived through. I asked someone, who do they belong to? Whose dogs are they? They said, oh, they're the town dogs. Everyone feeds them. We all like them. Well, this day that we were there with the medical brigade, they were providing free medical care. We were doing psych support, and a lot of other aid agencies were there giving out popcorn and hot dogs and food. Those dogs are lying down because they ate so much they couldn't move. Their stomachs were actually physically swollen, but it was to me a sign of self-care, man. They got through that hurricane and they had a treat. that day and got petted by more people than they'd ever seen. This is a picture again of Toa Baja, where we were in the central square. You can see the mold on the chairs. All that stuff had been underwater, but folks were coming in. Some of the elderly people there hadn't had their diabetes meds or anything else for, you know, several months. But it wasn't a depressing scene. It is really kind of uplifting sometimes to see how well people cope. So I'm going to give you this formula, and then I'm going to shift into taking some questions. But the ACT formula comes from a book I love. I'd recommend it to you. I'd recommend it to your students, your family. It's an older book. There's several different editions. You can get it on Amazon used for like $4. But it's called Rapid Relief from Emotional Distress, and it has this little formula in it, which I have used for everything from being late to a meeting to dealing with the disaster in Puerto Rico. And here's the formula, ACT. A is accept reality. That is the hardest thing to do about a stressful situation. We all want to say, if only, I wish, maybe. People come in my private practice, they could talk indefinitely, literally weeks, on what they don't like about their partner. If only he would do this, if only she would stop doing that. I can bring them to a grinding halt by going to the sea. Fine, I have a good idea of what they do that drives you nuts. So you tell me 3 things you want them to do that'll make you feel better. Create a vision. What is it you want them to do? That's hard. And the creative vision cannot be idealistic. If you're going to apply this formula, it has to be based on the actual reality. So if your husband's a workaholic and he's not going to come home in time to help you get the kids in bed, the reality is you have 2 choices. One is to work around that and find a way to get him engaged with the kids. The other is to talk about whether you're going to stay married. But you can't say, if only he'd change, then I'll do X, because that's not accepting the reality. It's really based on the fact that you can't change things around you. You can only change how you respond. The T, take action, is easy if you actually did A and C. You know, I cut it tight all the time. I leave late. I don't want to leave an unfinished project. I find myself driving somewhere. I know I'm going to be late, but I'm doing that magical thinking. If only the light changes, if only there's a perfect parking spot, if only they start the meeting late. And I realize I have to start saying, you know what? I left the house too late. I have to accept reality. I'm going to be late. So the vision is, maybe I'll call and say I'm still coming, tell the student I'm late, whatever it is I need to do. It's a lot easier to take action after I get out over the if only thinking. But here at Toa Baja, what we had to say is, this is a level of poverty most of us have never seen. I grew up in California. The poverty there reminded me of Tijuana, and yet this is an American territory. A lot of these elderly people didn't have a good life before, so we weren't going to change their whole environment. But what was the vision? What could we do that day to make people healthier, or to give them some strategies, or to help them to think about things differently? It was all psych first aid. But even just in some cases, having someone listen and talk to them made a huge difference. I would actually challenge you, if you're facing a stressor, this seems so dumb, it seems so, my students will roll their eyes. MC's on the ACT formula again. But then they would try it. And they found out, especially the kids coming out of Italy, found out that it was really kind of a helpful way to address the stress that was going on in their lives. So I'm going to end with this picture, and then I'm going to take some questions. When we were in Puerto Rico, we were staying in this house where the cat is sitting. It was an Airbnb, but we got it because there was no air, so they couldn't use it for money. And I don't know if the owners owned the cat or who owned the cat, but he lived on the roof of that house, and he gave us that imperious look every single day as we drove away. And I don't know how he got through the hurricane. I don't know what he was eating, but he was surely resilient. The other picture is one that can almost make me tear up looking at it even now. Calle is a little town up in the mountains in Puerto Rico. And this was at a parochial school. And they had already scheduled this conference for parochial school teachers from all over Puerto Rico to come before the hurricane. They made the decision to have the meeting anyway. If you look, we're in kind of like a gym / meeting room, and all the garage doors and windows are open because there was no power. The nuns had a generator, so they were running the microphone. And we gave all kinds of suggestions. We talked about coping with stress and mental health through a translator. And then we watched this nun with no accompaniment stand up and start singing, and all of the teachers stood up and started singing too. And it once again reminded me that people are very resilient, but we do have to use our social skills, our cognitive skills, all of that to help each other. So I'm going to stop on that note. I think I might be able to see the chat, or I may have to wait for Chris to tell me what questions people would like to hear.
Oh, thank you so much. That was an absolutely incredible presentation. We do have quite a few questions in the chat. Lots of people giving thumbs up, nodding along. They are very appreciative. One question that came from the chat, and faculty, you are welcome to unmute as well, but I'd like to start off with a question from your colleague, Dr. Ross. You ended on this incredibly hopeful note about resiliency and being flexible. And you talked earlier about, accepting reality as well as kind of a first step to that. What do we do when we can't accept the reality that others won't accept reality? That they won't wear masks. They don't really acknowledge what's happening. How do we reconcile ourselves to that?
They keep insisting that we can go back and have college like we always did, and somehow manage, and not anybody's going to get sick.
Yeah. What we're doing is accepting the reality. I actually wrote about this not long ago. For some people, the reality of this pandemic is so scary or so incomprehensible or so distant that they're coping by avoidance. So accepting reality is that's the way they're coping. And we can talk until we're blue in the face and they're not going to change. So creative vision is, if a proportion of our population is not going to do these things, then how are we going to work around them? What mask or face mask are we going to wear when we go back to school? If we do, how are we going to argue for the positions that we think are important? But a real reality of humans is they won't change if they don't want to. And so accepting reality is not saying they're right or I accept their reality. It's saying that is the obstacle I face, and how am I going to create a vision to manage it?
Thank you so much, Mary. Another question from, I believe it was Jody earlier. We have a lot of student-centric questions, questions from professors who are, I think this is true of a lot of the crowd, very empathetic, very warm and engaging with their students. Is there a point where can we be too warm and engaging in a time of crisis? Can we be too fun in a time of crisis? Should we take all our funny jokes out of our slides now that we are in the time of crisis? How do we adapt our teaching in that sense?
If we didn't want funny jokes, then Colbert and Kimmel and those guys would be off the air. Humans use jokes and they use gallows humor to get through. I wouldn't take out jokes unless they are somehow insensitive to the situation. But I would acknowledge at the same time why we're doing it, why we're talking about it, how it fits. And we can be too empathic. We don't want to give students so much leeway that they don't feel any obligation to do the work or to meet the standards. We're still trying to get them to have a viable education, to learn things. And we can take on too much of their pain or their problems. And that's where the boundary setting talk really comes in. This is gallows humor from the disaster world. But the joke is you can't save every puppy in the pound. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you're walking around a shelter and some of the people are very distraught and there isn't an easy solution, you have to acknowledge that you're not going to fix them all. And I think that's true with students too. We're there for them, we help them, we give them access, we do things in good faith. And that's still not going to fix everybody. That's part of accepting reality. And that's part of, as a therapist, that, you know, I had a therapist supervisor who said the first year of my internship, if you cannot tolerate the idea that you might someday lose a patient to suicide, then change fields. You know, you're not always going to save everybody. And then the next thing is, but can you always feel like you did the best of your ability, that what you did didn't make the situation worse?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Spot on. Speaking of boundary setting, I want to kind of jump back to something Mariana mentioned in the chat thread as well. You spoke about boundary setting with students, but how do we set boundaries with our institutions when we're being spammed with email updates about all the things that are happening, all the things that are required of us? How do we kind of take time for self-care and space when we're employees of institutions which might actually be stressing us out?
Absolutely. That's a topic I have also done a lot of interviews on, not just our institutions, but also the news media and the social media flow and all of the constant demands. I can do another whole hour on that, but my bottom line is that we have to consciously set boundaries there as well. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to tell your students, to tell your staff, whoever, you know, here's when I answer emails. And it's not going to be on Sunday, or it's not going to be after 7 o'clock. I'll get back to you at another time. I don't know what it is about technology, but you know, it's almost impossible not to answer a ringing cell phone. It just feels like if it rings, you got to see who it was. But they all have off buttons. And I have the hardest time getting my students, you know, sophomores, junior students, to spend 24 hours without their cell phone next to their pillow. But when they do it, they realize that half the time the crises that people are giving you, if you just wait it out, they go away. You know, if you wait long enough, a lot of the email becomes obsolete. Now, I'm not saying ignore it all, but I'm saying give yourself permission to set realistic boundaries about when you're going to do it, realistic expectations about how fast you're going to get back to people. And I'm not doing this great at home, so I don't want to sound like I got it all wired, but it's especially hard when you're working from home, because it's all here. Your office, your kitchen table, everything's mixed in. And I think we almost need to start creating some boundaries. Like, you know, normally you leave work, you drive home, there's a little bit of time in between to think. So maybe you could have a pattern where you stop working at 5:30 and go exercise or take a walk or do something to draw a line and say, oh, okay, now I am off the clock and I'm doing something else.
That's wonderful. I think we all wish we did that a little bit more than we actually wind up doing it, and it's good advice to keep in mind.
Hard, I know.
Yeah. A question kind of the opposite of boundary setting in a way from Rosalia. There is obviously a lot of professors who feel very connected to their students. What about those moments where maybe compassion fatigue is set in and you kind of detach when your students bring a problem to you? Are there strategies to kind of keep yourself from doing that, that kind of build upon what you were saying?
That's a little tricky, because sometimes I think it's a good idea to detach. You know, if you really watched every single commercial on TV about starving dogs, you probably wouldn't be able to function. Sometimes you have to turn the stuff off. And it's the same with your students. You don't have to get on the same emotional train with them to help them. If you're starting to get caught up in their emotions, that's a good sign of compassion fatigue. So what you want to do then is figure out how to get them the resources they need. You're not the person to solve it, but you help them call counseling services. You connect them with the ombuds. You do something. And then you say to yourself, if I feel this way about this student, what's going on? What's going on with me? Do I need a break? Do I need a weekend off? Do I need more sleep? I mean, you use that to think about what's the root cause of it. Sometimes it's legitimately that student. There are students that'll get on your last nerve, and it's okay to say that as well. But sometimes it's not the student, it's the timing, and that's when you need to see what it is about your situation.
Mary.
Excellent. Oh, please, Dr. Ross.
Mary and I were in a conversation earlier this week where we realized that for most of us who are going to be all online, and for students who are going to be all online, that this squared face, this professor may be one of the main connections the students have with the university. They're used to having their fraternity or their dormitory or their people that they eat with or exercise with in their teams or whatever. So that, you know, we kind of realize that we have a double, not only do we have to be doing emotional, psychological first aid, as Mary suggested, but we also have kind of a new job to help the students feel that they belong. And that kind of hit me between the eyes the other day, and I just thought it'd be worth reminding people. And Mary, you might have had some more thoughts about that after we had that conversation. Did you want to add to that?
I think it's going to be harder. You know, like you said, the in-person pieces, the football games, all those things. But even just talking about the future, laying out the fact it's not always going to be this way will help. And actually, Kathy, I was kind of going a different way with that, because what Kathy and I do for each other is we're kind of the social support partner for each other. Like sometimes I'll just send her a text and say, I'm getting overwhelmed by X. And maybe every faculty should figure out someone who's willing to be that person for them this fall. To, you know, as a therapist again, I don't do therapy in a vacuum. I work in an office. There's other therapists there. And we have a standing agreement that I can go to them and they can come to me and say, hey, I'm a little stumped by this. Will you let me run through it? And I think we could be doing that as faculty and just making sure that you're on point.
It's sort of nice too that she's at a different campuses than mine. And I think the fact that Course Hero helps a lot of you folks also connect across campuses might be useful too, making friendships. So go to the cocktail party this evening.
One of the best things is when you get in that rut of thinking your school is just messing everything up. And then you talk to other people and you go, oh no, it's not just that. Other places are just as screwed up, but it's actually really normalizing. I use that word in psych first aid. It's good to hear that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ross, for the quick plug. Please do come to the happy hour. Let's continue the support. Let's continue looking out for each other. And thank you all for attending. Thank you, Mary, especially. I think that's a presentation we all needed.
I'll talk about it more if anyone wants to reach out to me on email. So take care.